So this morning, quickly going over the overarching, purpose of the Academy. So again, designed to give you an interactive experience so that you can successfully determine and solve safety issues on our roadways in whatever function you serve at FDOT. So five big steps that we're trying to take here. We're still in this first big idea of understanding our mission. We'll be getting into finding and using crash data and safety data later this week, and then jumping into the top 3 emphasis areas and how to apply the things that we're learning right now in those areas. So we're in module 3 today. We're going to be focused on the safe system approach. We've talked a little bit about that in the past 2 modules, but today we're going to be diving in a little bit deeper to the principles and strategies associated with that. So today's learning objectives: understanding the safe system approach. What are the elements of a safe system approach? How does that differ from traditional road safety? So if you've been in the industry for the last 20 or 30 years, what's different about the safe system approach? And then what are some strategies that you can employ on the work that you're doing to implement the safe system approach? All right, and that kind of covers what we just did visually. So jumping into this first part, principles of the safe system approach. So Nathan mentioned this last time. One of two of the really big emphasis on safe system is, well, one, we want to eliminate fatal and serious injuries for all road users, right? And 2 ways that we do that in safe system is by accommodating human mistakes and lowering impacts on the human body. So understanding that when a crash does occur, the kinetic energy transfer that's happening between those vehicles or between the vehicle and a pedestrian or bicyclist is what ultimately is causing that serious injury or fatality. So keeping impacts on the human body at a tolerable level. So we go into our work understanding that humans are fallible and we all make mistakes, right? So we want to have safe road users, but we want to, as designers and managers of the system, be aware that humans will make mistakes, and how can we accommodate those mistakes as best we can so that they don't result in life-altering consequences. And as Nathan said a couple of times last week, humans are squishy. So I want you to remember that. Humans are squishy. It doesn't take a lot to damage us. So our approach is to manage those impacts on human bodies. So with that said, 6 safe system principles, and we're going to walk through these one by one, but death and serious injury are not acceptable. Humans make mistakes. Humans are vulnerable. Responsibility is shared. Safety is proactive, and redundancy is crucial. And we'll get into each one of these 6. So we know that no crashes are desirable, but with the safe system approach, we're really focusing in on those that result in death or serious injury. We don't want crashes on our transportation system to result in those types of life-altering changes to an individual or to their families and friends. Humans make mistakes. Again, we've talked a little bit about this already, but how can we be aware of, be cognizant of what those types of mistakes will be in our system, and how can we design to accommodate those as best we can? Humans are vulnerable. So when you look at the impact speed and the fatality risk for a crash, you can see that as the impact speed goes up, say from 20 to 40, this is kilometers per hour, but you can make a similar shape with miles per hour. The fatality risk is going to go up exponentially, and that's because kinetic energy is 1/2 mv squared, right? So the velocity factor in that is squared, and it's going to be an exponential increase until you get up there towards that 80-90% range. Responsibility is shared, so all stakeholders and in our case, transportation system users, managers, but that also includes vehicle manufacturers and healthcare professionals. must ensure that crashes don't lead to fatal and serious injuries. Safety is proactive. So we don't want to just respond to where crashes are happening. We want to think about the transportation system as a system, right? So in our system, where do we have the risks that are present? The crashes can tell us what risks are really most important in terms of what lead to fatalities and serious injuries, but we can identify where those risks exist in other parts of the system, and then think about use safe system principles, which we'll be talking a little more about today, to mitigate those risks. And then the sixth principle is that redundancy is crucial. So we mentioned this a couple times last week as well, but when you have 5 layers of protection in this case, safe road users, safe vehicles, safe speeds, safe roads, and post-crash care, those are all layers that allow, if one of those layers fails, the others still cover, and you don't have a fatality or serious injury occurring every time you have a crash if these things are in place. Before we jump into safe system elements, any quick questions on the 6 principles that we just covered? You'll see those kind of continue throughout the presentation, but I'm going to give a minute for a question or a comment. All right, so we'll jump into the safe system elements then. I really like this, this safe system graphic, this wheel on the right side of the slide. This is FHWA's icon or graphic that they use for the safe system approach. But in this graphic, you can see the 5 safe system elements there, kind of around the inner part of the wheel. And then on the outside, you see those 6 safe system principles. So those 6 principles are the ones that we just went over together. The 5 elements we'll go through one by one now. Those are safe road users, safe vehicles, safe speeds, safe roads, and post-crash care. So safe road users, when we think about safe road users, we're not just focused on motorists. We are focused on motorists, but we're also focused on pedestrians, bicyclists, transit riders, motorcyclists. So there's a lot of that piece that humans are vulnerable. Vulnerable road users are a key part of the safe road users. But I think 75% of our crashes that are resulting in fatality and serious injury are between 2 vehicles, 2 drivers. So they are absolutely still a very important part of the safe system approach. But under safe road users, we're aiming for safe behavior, really, right? Aim to encourage safe, responsible driving and behavior by the drivers and the road users. So what are some ways that, in the work that we do in this part of the industry, that we can influence that? FDOT runs safety campaigns throughout the year. They're in the middle of a 3-pronged behavior change campaign throughout the state of Florida that's focusing on aggressive driving behavior, speeding, and distracted driving. So here's a clip on the aggressive driving campaign. It's a 30-second clip. I'll go ahead and play for you.
Keep your distance. Embrace the space.
Has anybody seen that before on your television or billboards or radio? And I've seen it come across mine a few times. It's focused in South Florida, Central Florida, and the Tampa area, I believe.
Sounds like you're the target audience, Ryan.
Yeah, I'm not quite. I'm a little older than the target audience. I think the target audience is young male drivers up to like 30 or something. So obviously there's some other ways that we encourage safe road users. A lot of the signage that we have and that we put out on the roadways encourage to inform drivers, pedestrians, of how to behave, or that there are risks or danger maybe coming up with slick roads and things like that. All right, so the second feature is safe vehicles. So we have, new vehicles are coming out every year, right, with more and more advanced safety features that help minimize crashes, and in some cases even can prevent a crash from occurring by giving you that advanced warning. So some of these features include airbags, seat belts, lane departure alerts. Increasingly, we're having more advanced vehicle safety technology coming out as standard in these new vehicles. We also have pedestrian crash avoidance systems that are being developed or have been developed to actually sense pedestrians in front of you in the roadway, provide a warning, or maybe automatically brake your vehicle. Safe speeds is the third element. Speeding, speeds is a really big part of this. When we think about the low tolerance of the human body to suffer those impacts, a lot of the things that we're talking about can be solved with speed, right? So when you have these higher speed environments, or you have the vulnerable road users being impacted even at lower speeds, this is where this is one of the big ticket items, I think, with the safe system approach. So speeding can increase both the frequency and the severity of crashes, and then humans are more and more unlikely to survive crashes at higher speeds. So by reducing speeds, three things can happen. You can reduce impact forces. You can provide additional time for drivers to react and stop, so that perception reaction time, basically the needs of that go down as your speeds go down. And then you can also improve visibility and focus with lower speeds. This is an interesting statistic. This is from a fatality analysis reporting system, or FARS report back in 2020. The impact of the speed and the pedestrian's risk of death. So at a low, what we would consider low speed, 23 miles per hour, if a pedestrian's hit, 10% risk of fatality there. If you increase that 10 miles per hour, that goes up to 25%. If you increase that to 42 miles per hour, now you're at 50% risk of fatality if a pedestrian's hit at 42 miles per hour. You can see how just increasing that another 8 miles per hour really makes that percentage jump. So at 58 miles per hour, 90% chance the pedestrian doesn't live through that type of crash. So this should, when we think about safe speeds, context is really important, right? Should we be lowering speeds everywhere? No, not necessarily. But where you have a lot of pedestrian bicycle activity, particularly people in the streets or crossing the streets, we need to think differently about what are the target speeds and the appropriate speeds in those types of areas. Safe roads. So safe roads are designed and operated to prevent crashes among all road users, and if they do occur, to keep impacts on the human body at tolerable levels. So what does avoiding crashes involve? Three things that are really important. And this, if you've been involved before in conflict point analysis, that's, these first two are really aimed at that. Separating users in space, separating users in time, and then increasing attentiveness and awareness. And that kind of harkens back to safe road users as well, right? When we have better attentiveness, better awareness, we have better, safer road users. So some examples of separating users in space. On the left side of the screen here, you can see a separated bike lane. So, in a place where you have maybe some higher speeds on the roads, but you also anticipate bicyclists using this road, you want to, provide them a separate facility. Don't put them in the same lane, or maybe even with a lane immediately adjacent, but buffering that and providing a little bit of physical separation can avoid those crashes from happening. Another example of separating users in space is, with two vehicles, is an interchange, right? So when you have a ton of volume at an intersection, crossing, both directions, oftentimes we'll separate those in space with an overpass. So that's another way to separate users in space. at the vehicle level. Separating users in time. We do this all the time at intersections, right? We assign right away. We said we get to say who goes first, whether maybe it's a stop controlled condition or a signal phase, right? So you put signal phasing in that says, all right, these users can go when it's green and these users can't because it's red, and then we switch that around. At the pedestrian level, you have pedestrian walk phases, right, that allow pedestrians to cross the crosswalk without conflicting with vehicles that are also driving through the intersection. And then third, increasing attentiveness and awareness. So some of the ways that we do that is, by putting in signs, by putting in beacons. So here you have a RRFB at a pedestrian crossing, and it looks like you also have a bike trail crossing the street here. So this allows vehicles that are driving through this area to see more clearly when a pedestrian is about to cross or is crossing. So avoiding the crash, right? But then also keeping impacts on the human body at tolerable levels. So what are some ways we do that? Managing speed, we talked about that earlier. Managing crash angles. So, the types of conflicts that lead to severe injury, a lot of times are those right angle or those crossing conflicts at intersections. So how can we control those? We can change those so that they're not so much at a right angle, right? A roundabout does that beautifully. It takes those left turns that cross in front of an opposing through. It removes those from the intersection and puts them in as a conflict that happens on a circulatory roadway where everybody's merging or diverging together. A lot of our other innovative intersection designs seek to do that by removing left turns from the intersections, right? So you have displaced left turn movements where the left turns occur differently. You have median U-turns where they're basically taken out of the intersection and moved down the street as a U-turn. And then finally, managing crash energy distribution. So when you do have a crash, and a lot of times these may be single vehicle crashes with an element, fixed object or some element on the roadway, how can we manage that crash energy distribution? So, here you can see a barrier on I-4 that allows, if somebody did hit that, it would crumple up before the person experiences kind of the immediate loss of momentum by hitting a concrete wall. All right, we have a question or comment? We don't, okay, sorry, thought I saw something over there. So other element, safe roads. We're going to talk a lot about countermeasures in, is that the next module, Nathan? Countermeasures coming up, I think module 6. But just to give you a preview, the FHWA's proven safety countermeasures is a great source of 28 or 29 countermeasures that the Federal Highway Administration has said these are proven to reduce crashes or to reduce fatalities and serious injuries, and is really encouraging all the states to use them as frequently as they can in their projects. Florida actually has a great track record on using these proven safety countermeasures. You'll see a lot if you go to the website, you can just Google FHWA proven safety countermeasures. It'll take you right there. When you see a lot of what these countermeasures are, you'll say, oh, that's normal operating procedure for us. A lot of it is, what we have in our standards, but there are some things in here that that would be helpful for us to include and to look for opportunities to include in our future projects or ongoing projects. And then lastly is post-crash care, right? So when a crash does occur, and it's the type of crash that results in an incapacitating injury, how do we make sure that person gets the care that they need? So we need first responders to be able to quickly get there to the crash scene, stabilize and transport injured persons to the medical facilities that can help save their life. This also includes forensic analysis, traffic incident management, and other activities. So some statistics on this, of the 40,000 plus people that have died in the US every year. It's estimated that 20% of those, the trauma deaths, are preventable. So 20% of the deaths that happened could have been serious injuries, right? 2 out of 5 of those folks were alive when the first responders arrived, but they later died. More than 1/3 are not taken to a level 1 or level 2 trauma center. So whether that's, one doesn't exist in the area, or maybe it just takes too long to get there and then get the person there. And then there's a 25% increase in the odds of survival if a patient is treated in a hospital that is a level 1 or level 2 trauma center. So thinking about that in terms of how can we, when we're designing transportation systems, how can we make them accessible to the best quality post-crash care that we can provide? All right, so we've gone through the 6 safe system principles and the 5 elements. Any questions or comments? We take a quick break. See, Billy, you got your hand up?
Yes. The first, I guess, element for the aggressive drivers, I know like the main focus is, awareness and enforcement. I guess to lower the impacts from them. But in terms of, I guess, roadway design elements, has there been, I guess, any implementations, like it's design wise, that like has proven to, I guess, deal with aggressive driving in specific areas?
Engineering countermeasures you're referring to?
Yes.
I think one of them that maybe isn't as obvious as dealing with aggressive driving is, but I think it does, is traveler information systems, right? So if I'm driving on, I live up in Central Florida, right? So if I'm driving on I-4 and I see the DMS sign that says, here's how long it's going to take you to get to, the destination 12 miles down the road, to have some awareness that this is what it's going to take, I think helps put me in a right state of mind that this is what it's going to take. It is what it is, right? Traffic is traffic. So I think having that is helpful. There's more than just aggressive driving that gets at, but I think that type of sharing of information of traffic conditions is one way that's helpful. Obviously, there were no congestion, no delays. That would be another thing. But that usually works against some of the other things that we're working at, and it's also not realistic.
I think
Nathan,
there's I think there's a few others that could help. I mean, when we start, so this is a function of FDOT, but it's not necessarily safe road design, and that's mode shift. Moving over, say, like as we adopt transit or other things like that, I think can take people out of that and changes the expectations a little bit. I think too, when we talk about aggressive driving, it's always in the frame, like the aggressive driving generally means like fast lane changes and speeding, right? So if we're talking about speeding, in downtown Tampa, speeding is like going from 25 miles an hour or 30 miles an hour to 35 or 40 miles an hour. Whereas if it was marked 45 in here, then that would be more like 50, 60 miles an hour. So I think even normal like speed calming measures can help reframe. So even though they may still be speeding, it's still like bringing it down to a level that is a little bit more survivable than something higher. There's something we tried in the city of Lakeland, where we had a really good signal density. And actually, US 41 has been very successful in this as well, in terms of, say, speed calming, because what they're doing with this signal density is with a high enough density, you can very, very well control speed if you want to. So part of what you're doing is you're reducing like stale greens in the green band, and you're condensing your platoons. So if your platoons are a little bit more condensed, even though you may end up with a bunch of weaving, you're still not moving fast at the same time, right? I think stuff like that can help. And I think as we go on with some of the other measures, Like even with signal timing, right? There's some systems out there that detect how fast people are going, and then they can, if they're going too fast, they can change to red. And then I think as well as changing the conflict points, right? So like if you're erratically driving in a roundabout versus a signal, like if let's say you're trying to squeeze your way in a roundabout when you shouldn't, you're dealing largely with a side swipe. Whereas like if you're going through a signal when you shouldn't because it's pink when you go through the light. Now you're dealing with a T-bone, right? It's a lot more significant of a crash pattern. So while I'm not sure that we can always put, like Ryan was saying, managing expectations and taking people out of the system can help manage the aggressiveness. But then I think there's also the thing of if people are going to be aggressive, how do we measure it? How do we mitigate the consequences of that?
Limit their impact.
Did that answer, Billy? Was that good?
Yeah, that's perfect. Thank you.
Okay. Lori? Were you the one that hand raised earlier?
Oh, yes.
Okay.
Thank you. So question, the assumption that I feel like is being made is that all humans are the same. Are there situations with children or certain people where some crashes that we're assuming are the most dangerous types, where maybe like a side swipe or another kind of crash or a rear end could be more dangerous for babies or kids, or is it pretty much all the same that head-on crashes and the more severe crashes are going to be more severe for all human bodies?
So there's two ideas there, right? So one is, are all people the same? And that's no. There's definitively issues with survivability in different population segments, especially the older population segments. Their ability to take an impact, sustain it, and then recover from it is severely damaged. The second question, I think, is, do different people experience different crash types differently? I don't think so, with an exception potentially of babies, just because that's, if you think you've got you have to do rear facing car seats for a while. But largely it has to do, there's a number of things that has to do with rear end versus angle crash, for instance. When you look at crash testing standards, something could be, say, 5 stars for an angle crash and 5 stars for a rear end. That doesn't mean that the standard is the same for them, though. Like it doesn't, even though they're both 5 stars, it doesn't mean that they can take the same impact. And that has to do with vehicle construction and crumple zones. So there's a lot of, like, I don't know, I hear my grandparents and my parents talk about, like all the old cars that were full frames, and they never, like you could get hit and it'd still keep driving and the frame wasn't bent. It's just a solid chunk of steel. And while there may be some truth in a hyper fatal crash, a lot of the crashes now are designed to be very strong around necessarily like around the occupant, but everything else crumbles. So if you think about like crash attenuators, that's what you're dealing with a rear end, is you're dealing with the attenuation of the trunk, or like I have a truck, so like I have a 6-foot bed that someone has to get through before they finally get to me. So that's a lot of space. Whereas if someone hits me right on the side, I'm dealing with like this much of a door panel that is trying to protect me. It just by necessity of a vehicle design. And then with head-on, the issue with the head-on crashes is, if you are like with the rear end, if you're at a dead stop and the person that hits you is going 40 miles an hour, right? That energy transfer is the mass of the vehicle times the 40 miles an hour squared, like 1/2 of that, right? That's the kinetic energy transfer. With a head-on crash, if you're both going 40 miles an hour, that's a difference of 80 miles an hour. And that's where the severity of their increases. So the severity by crash type is largely based on the construction of the vehicles and the energy transfer of those vehicles, and they like that, and that construction of the vehicle depends on how well it can absorb or mitigate that impact. That makes sense?
Yeah, thank you so much. Thanks.
One other thing, I mean, when you mentioned, small children versus adults, I think one of the things that we talk about in safe vehicles often is that vehicles are getting larger in the marketplace, right? And sometimes that means they're getting taller. And so pedestrian crashes are actually resulting in more severe injuries and fatalities because a taller vehicle hitting a pedestrian above their center of mass is different than a kind of a ground vehicle hitting them below their center of mass. There's more chance of them surviving if they're able to basically go up onto the hood or the windshield. I guess I hadn't really thought about that before from the height of the person's perspective, but yeah, a child would definitely be more vulnerable in a pedestrian crash for that reason, for basically any type of vehicle.
I think there's also like the risk factors as well, right? Like looking at, because one of the ideas is mitigating exposure and risk to where we may not prevent it, but like let's reduce the amount of time. And I don't know if you've seen, so I'm trying to think how to explain it. My truck's an 07. It was when they started really doing the square bodies, and it was a pain to get used to parking because you can't see anything in front of you, so you can't feel where you're at, and it's really difficult, especially when you're dealing with like a short car. There's a lot of pictures on the internet, and maybe it might be interesting to throw it in, some of them where even in terms of visibility, it's showing how like the modern popular pickups, whether it's a Ram truck, a Silverado, F-150, they have larger blind spots than like a Kenworth, like an 18-wheeler or even an M1 Abrams. And they were doing that for the dramatic effect, but it still makes a point that you have a large tractor trailer or a freaking tank, like a main battle tank, and you can see a child in front of your main battle tank more easily than I can in a Silverado. So I think there's some issues there as well, especially when you're talking about crosswalk safety and things like that. But it is, I think I mentioned one of the last ones where Ryan was talking about the impacts. We're used to that impact would hit at the legs and people would fold over. And now that you're getting your thorax, and then a full chest impact, and it's crushing the chest, throwing you, and then the back of you, or however you land, your head is hitting on the asphalt after being thrown a fair distance, and that's dramatically increasing the fatality rates. But it's also on like we talk about the fatalities going up. Ryan, you may know, I thought Chris Craig or someone had worked on a study in central office looking at that, and they did find that the size of the vehicles now is becoming is becoming a significant factor in the fatality rates rising, just because it's much harder to protect against that heavy of a vehicle. Even the Rivian, there's actually a couple months ago, they're finding that all of our like our Jersey barrier, basically all of our crash cushions right now are ineffective against some of the electric vehicles, because some of the major production ones as well, because of how heavy they are. Katie?
Yeah, I was just gonna add one quick thing. I don't know if it's kind of already been said, but about the vulnerability of like the younger population. For those that aren't aware, maybe everybody is, but we have the helmet law in Florida for kids 16 and under. And so as a parent, I didn't really pay attention to that before until I got into safety. And now like I won't let my kids ride their bikes without their helmet. And so they can't ride to school because I'm not there to make sure that they're wearing their helmets. And so that's just like the little things that like, the law is there to protect. So there's a reason, because they're more vulnerable. So just think about that. But, until I got into safety, I didn't really understand the importance of the helmet. Of course, adults should wear them too if they can. But it is the law until they're 16. And I told my children I'm in safety, and if something happened to them, I wouldn't be able to live with myself. There's
a strong survivorship bias in transportation, because we have so much exposure to transportation as part of our daily lives. And we started to get into that, like, well, you know, and you see it on Facebook, the memes where it's like, well, we survived this back in our day and stuff like that. And the thing is it's a survivorship bias. That when you start actually getting into the data and you look at it, you say, okay, like you may have, but that doesn't mean that it's safe or that it's good. You have all these other statistics that, you know, it's like having pools in your house with small children, at your house with small children, whether it's wearing your helmet, wearing your seatbelt. You know, like we talked about that the other day, like my grandfather will not wear a seatbelt. He's convinced that he's safer without the seatbelt. But when you get into the data and you look at it and you say, okay, well, almost 50% of our fatalities in Florida weren't wearing their seatbelt. Like how difficult it doesn't necessarily mean they would have survived. There's some of them that wouldn't have, even if they were wearing it. But still, like how many people will be saved by those small actions that we would take just because we have a survivorship bias and it hasn't happened to us yet.
All right, good discussion. So we have plenty of time for discussion, by the way. This is a shorter presentation, so we will have another opportunity to do that. Safe system versus traditional approach. So we've talked a little bit about this already, but just want to read this quote from FHWA. Whereas traditional road safety strives to modify human behavior and prevent all crashes, the safe system approach also refocuses transportation system design and operation on anticipating human mistakes and lessening impact forces to reduce crash severity and save lives. So we kind of started with that at the beginning. That's one of the key differences in the safe system approach versus traditional safety. It's that focus on anticipating human mistakes and then lessening the impact forces when these crashes do occur. And I know Nathan shared this slide last week, but just kind of to re-emphasize it, the safe system is focused on preventing deaths and serious injuries, not all crashes, designing for human mistakes and limitations, as opposed to, you know, expecting everyone to use the system perfectly, reduce system kinetic energy, share responsibility, and proactively identify and address risks in the system. So again, the Swiss cheese model of redundancy, you know, if all these layers are in place, when something slips through one, it can be caught by another. A death or serious injury can only happen if all 5 layers or all 5 elements fail. All right, so what are some strategies? And some of the questions that were asked, we're kind of getting at that, right? We're engineers and planners, and so we're focused on solutions, right? So what are some strategies that we can be talking about when we talk about the safe system? So again, anticipating human errors, separating users in space. We talked about that a little bit earlier. So typically when you have travelers moving at different speeds or directions, or you have that, I think, you know, that differential in vulnerability, so vehicles versus pedestrians or vehicles versus bikes, separating them in space is a strategy that we want to put in place if we can. So sidewalks, separated bike lanes, you know, on high-speed facilities, turn lanes to allow vehicles to get out of the main travel lane while they're decelerating, and then interchanges as well, right? So we have separating vehicles in space with overpasses where you have that type of high volume, high speed intersection. Separating users in time. So when we have conflict points, this, you know, primarily occurs at intersections. How can we separate users in time so that they can exist in the same physical space, but, you know, in appropriate order? So intersection signal phasing, pedestrian scramble phase, where you have, you know, you have pedestrian phasing at intersections, but a scramble phase would be where it's a pedestrian only phase for a time. Increasing attentiveness and awareness. So alerting users to those potential hazards and presence of other users by increasing visibility, increasing attentiveness, and reducing impairment. So what are some examples of that? Daylighting intersections. If you've not heard that term before, that's the idea that you're basically clarifying that an intersection exists as you're approaching it. So if you're in a vehicle approaching an intersection, taking all the corners and removing all the clutter from those corners, right? So if you have on-street parking, if you have landscaping, daylight intersections would be like putting in bulb outs to really define that intersection, so that as you're coming to it, you can see everything that is on the corners. If you have pedestrians or bicyclists standing there and waiting to cross or starting to cross, you're able to see everything much better. What are some other ways to increase attentiveness and awareness? Rumble strips, street lighting, alcohol detection, right? So helping users when they're already in a state of impairment be aware that they're not ready to drive. Accommodating human injury tolerance. So what are some ways that we do that? One is reducing speeds, right? So reducing speed can dramatically improve a person's chance of surviving a crash. Some examples of this, the roadways, physical roadway designs that limit free flow speeds on roads. And again, think about this in the context of where the road is and what would be appropriate for that. Traffic calming treatments, traditional or automated enforcement. We've got just to go back to this one for a second, we have a high emphasis on this within FDOT in the past several years, right? With the introduction of context class and building that into basically all parts of a project development process. So now we're more focused on target speed. And when we're designing a roadway or doing a project on an existing roadway, instead of just thinking about what's the 85th percentile out there and that we should be designing for, we want to start with what's the target speed that we want people to be driving in this context. And then we try to design for that and actually influence the driver's speeds. So in addition to reducing speeds, reducing impact forces, right? So this can be done via infrastructure, vehicle design, or having proper recovery areas. So here's some examples of reducing impact forces. Intersections that do that just through the way that they're designed. Roundabouts, change the angle. I mentioned some of the innovative intersection treatments that basically eliminate the left turn crashes from the intersection and accommodate those movements elsewhere. Occupant protection, right? So within the safe vehicle element, we have airbags and seatbelts. The exterior physical design, Nathan talked about how vehicles are basically made to crumple and absorb momentum before that really impacts the person. Automated braking and roadside crash worthiness. So here's an example in District 5 that we can talk about some of the countermeasures or safety elements that were put into a project and how they relate to the safe system approach. So this is State Road 436, also called Cimarron Boulevard, from Old Cheney Highway to University Park Place. So this is east of downtown Orlando, basically between downtown Orlando and University of Central Florida campus. So the redesign of the road was looking to lower speeds and create safe roads. It had a speed of 50 miles per hour at the time of the project. The target speed was determined to be 45 miles per hour for this context, and wanted to increase the safety of all road users. This is a heavily traveled road, a lot of ADT, but also really high transit use. So you have a lot of pedestrians and bicyclists walking and riding and using transit along this road. So some of the improvements that were recommended for the project: reducing lane widths. We had 12-foot lanes out there. We wanted to reduce those to 11 feet. And with that extra space, and there was a shoulder, we could add separated bike lanes. We wanted to remove the right turn lanes mid-block, not located at the signalized intersections, and reallocate that space to the buffered bike lanes throughout the corridor. We also wanted to add pedestrian hybrid beacons to mid-block crossings and relocate our transit stops to those mid-block crossings. We also removed channelized right turn lanes at the signalized intersections and enhanced the signalized intersection crossings, including adding leading pedestrian intervals at the signalized intersection. If you don't know what a leading pedestrian interval is, I'll just mention that real quick. A leading pedestrian interval is basically a head start for pedestrians at a signalized intersection. So normally when the light turns green and the walk phase comes up at the same time, that's a typical pedestrian phase. With a leading pedestrian interval, while that light is still red, the pedestrian phase will come on walk for about 3 seconds or 4 seconds, allowing the pedestrian to get just out into the crosswalk. And that really allows them to get a head start, really establish their right of way. And then when the light turns green, if you have a person that wants to turn right there, they're yielding to that pedestrian rather than trying to go in front of them and keeping them from beginning their walk phase. You might hear those referred to as LPI as well. So I only take the time to explain that because I'm not sure if everybody's dealing with that in their particular job here at FDOT. So here's an example of the existing cross section versus the proposed cross section. You can see how a lot of it is reallocation of space within the roadway envelope, right? So how are we deciding to use that space to create a safer road and safer conditions? So any maybe quick question, what are, of some of the things I mentioned, and maybe I'll go back to this slide, how do you see some of these elements fitting into, how do you see some of these safety elements fitting into the safe system elements that we were talking about before? Yeah, Billy?
So yeah, I see a couple of elements I guess that prevents bad, I guess not, I don't want to say bad driving, but dangerous driving or reckless driving, like the reducing the lane widths that makes people aware. And then we have one where I guess people make mistakes, like the separated bike lanes, like we talked about earlier, where you're trying to separate people, so you give them enough space that when a mistake does happen, you reduce the the chance of someone getting hurt.
Absolutely. Lori?
An example is the add leading pedestrian intervals increases driver attention and awareness that there are pedestrians and they need to yield to pedestrians.
Yep, excellent. Lois?
I think one thing that popped into my head is this idea of critical mass. And as more and more of these roads are modified to add these safety countermeasures, they'll be presumed to be the norm as opposed to what is happening now, that these are the exception more than the rule. So over time, this will, should have more and more impact.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, when you talk about critical mass, this is a corridor that's also planned for a bus rapid transit route in the future. And so when you see that type of high quality transit service come into play, you expect to see significant increases in the pedestrian and bicycle traffic around there as well.
Well, and also just how we count things, not vehicle throughput, but person trips.
Exactly. Yep.
Managed, and you look at that same corridors at moving the same number of people and more safely, or even more people safely.
Right. And that helps too with the conversation of measures of effectiveness, right? Because we have traditionally certain measures of effectiveness like level of service or delay. So one thing I noticed when I was at the department is like with SMART goals, right? We want to have SMART goals. And it makes sense, right? We want things not to be left up to speculation. But I think the challenge is sometimes picking things that are hard to measure. And we're left with things like, say, like going back to level of service and delay, because those are easy to measure in their traditional techniques. But when you start getting into like pedestrian level of service or pedestrian comfort, decisions start to be made a little bit differently. So I think your point of that critical mass and making it accepted is very well taken. I mean, when we look at bike lanes, I was there when the bike lane discussion started happening. And there's a lot of, we don't need bike lanes on the road, why bikes on the road? And then now we're like, okay, well, hey, we accept that bikes are here. Now let's talk about, like with FHWA, what type of facility are we selecting? Are we selecting, like, is a bike lane appropriate for every road, or maybe a separated facility like that's next to the road? We take some right away from the cars, give it to the bikes. A separated bike lane being there, whether it's a trail or something else like that. And we keep growing and getting in that mindset. Sometimes I look at, like, when we talk about what we want to put space to for other users, it's kind of like balance. Like, we think of our typical section in the right of way, we had the space between right of way lines. It's kind of like our personal budget, right? Sometimes it feels like we've been paying for renovations to our house when we haven't been paying our bills. And we need to go back and start paying our bills, which is providing the accommodations for all users before we start, getting the extras, which is maximizing throughput. Like, we can worry about throughput once we have a minimum accommodation for everyone. But yeah, I definitely, and we've seen too, if you go in and look at all the standard plans and the FDM, what's phenomenal about the electronic versions is we can change it every year now, right? Like, we don't have to sit there and wait for the next edition to come out, and there's memos that are lost someplace else. Michael Shepard's been doing a phenomenal job as we get the knowledge, updating the design standards and making sure that this is the new way that we do business. It's an excellent
Well, this
point.
is Lois again. Just to clarify that, performance metrics, what we look at, what do we follow, what do we track to see if we're being successful? I think the notion of throughput is connected to speed. So just another way of thinking about, again, focused on person trips. What's the point? You're trying to get people to their destinations. So it's not one or the other in my mind. It's, are we accommodating the travel demand and doing it in a way that is multimodal as possible and safe as possible? And it comes down to person trips or trips with goods, for example.
100%. And there's this is more probably at the local level, but there's discussion about going from level of service to vehicle miles traveled, right? Because if you think about impact fees for development, if you're based on a level of service and your requirements on the infrastructure side are going to be higher to maintain a certain level of service, then, for instance, you're going to be pushing out to the higher speed areas, the more rural areas, because it makes sense to build there. Whereas if you focus on vehicle miles traveled, you start getting the mixed use development. It doesn't matter if you're putting it more in slower areas that are safer, that are accommodating more users. So there's a lot. I mean, we look at peak hour, design roadways for peak hour as opposed to like a design day. There's a lot of things. I think you've got a phenomenal point. When we look at our metrics, there's a lot that could change if we change how we're looking at our metrics.
One last thing, I'll be quiet, is, use of level of traffic stress. I think that is a real leg up for, no pun intended, for people who walk and bike, in terms of getting an elevated presence in these conversations. And it's really taking off, it seems like, in a lot of places, including our quality level of service handbook for bike and ped.
Yep. Lois, you can have as many points as you'd like. I love these. Keep bringing it. Lori?
Will you please explain again what it means to, which one? About the right turn lanes. What's the change with the right turn lanes not located at signalized intersection?
Let me show you so what they were able to do on this auxiliary lane. Do you guys see my pointer? Oh no,
No.
here, I'm on the wrong screen.
Oh, there
Here
it
we
is.
go. So this 12-foot auxiliary lane, they, by removing that mid-block, like, not at the signalized intersections where they need the right turn lanes for capacity purposes, but on the straight segments between signalized intersections, they're able to remove that and build in a separate bike facility. So the bike facility is separated from the roadway on this side physically. And so that's, by removing the right turn lane, they were able to do that. If they didn't remove the right turn lane, they would have had trouble making that happen for the bicycle facility.
So are people just slowing down in the next right lane right there?
Correct,
And
yeah,
then
so
to turn, okay.
yeah, you're gonna have slower speeds in that right lane, and it is a 6-lane facility. But in that right lane, you're gonna have slower speeds, where there's driveways.
And there's nothing wrong with that. And when you're making decisions like this, there is an NCHRP out about reallocation of cross sections that helps daylight the decision-making process. So it kind of documents and walks everybody through it so that it's not I think it's a process that gets the logic out in the open, so that people can see why it's being made and we can make honest decisions about where the cross section, how it needs to be allocated to different users.
You want to post a link to that, Nathan? It's a pretty
Yes.
relevant article to what we're talking about. Brad?
Yeah, I guess the right turn lane was giving me a little concern of all the proposals, but I guess in this typical, it's a little different than we would have on most of our roadways here, where we may have a permit that dedicated that right of way to make that right turn lane. So that's what, I don't know, removing it in that case where you had really constrained right of way and they dedicated some land for it, that gave me some pause. But I guess in this case, you have a swale, huge amount of right of way. It wasn't really a super constrained corridor like we would see on most of our urban roads down here.
Correct. Yeah, this is a unique, this is a picture of it. So yeah, it's not quite as condensed. There are portions that it's basically between two fairly condensed areas that I think look a lot more like District 4. Katie's familiar with this area, right? You're a UCF grad, so. All right, Carla, you have your hand up?
Just to add to that, because my thought was also the same, that when we look at things like access management reviews, we would usually ask people to put in right turn lanes because of that slowing down. And I get that there would be lower speeds on that right turn lane, but wouldn't you assume that there would be then an increase in potentially rear end crashes?
Yeah, I think there's a trade-off there, right? Where it's lower speeds and maybe more rear end crashes happening at those lower speeds versus getting those turning vehicles out of the through traffic, but accepting higher speeds and using the space to do that.
And that's one of the big differences with the Vision Zero safe system approach, right? Is we're not focused on all crashes. Like if it's a decision of crashes versus like we have crashes or not crashes, then maybe, but we're focused on fatal and severe injury crashes. So if we can lower all the speeds and, for instance, provide a separated facility for bicyclists or pedestrians that's safer, that's a vulnerable user that, at a 20 mile an hour, 20, 30 mile an hour crash, while it's survivable mostly, is still going to leave a lot of impact than having your vehicle rear-ended at 20 miles an hour. There is a trade-off, and that's how our decision-making process goes, right? Whereas we're no longer worried about every crash. What we're looking at is that trade-off of making sure we're prioritizing the reduction of fatal and severe crashes over all crashes.
And we do have a lot of bicycle activity and as a result, bicycle crashes on this corridor. So it is something they were trying to solve for. Katie?
Well, just in line with what you said about like Vision Zero, a lot of the agencies are creating high injury networks where, for DOT, a lot of our discussions over the last 10, however many years have been the high crash locations. Well, roundabout's a high crash location, but it's not gonna be on your high injury network. And that's the flip in philosophy, right?
Mm-hmm. And with the permitting issue, so coming from access management in my first foray into traffic engineering, the dedications would theoretically be there for a right turn lane, but then you also question like the dedications for sidewalk. I know different districts have had it. Our district was, we requested it if sidewalk was existing and if it needed it. But really the donation isn't necessarily for a right turn lane. It's because of a right turn lane, but it's for the mitigation of their traffic impacts. And while it is definitely a question that should be asked, it kind of goes back to that first question I posed. Once we know we can make a difference, we kind of have to, right? So at least my personal view on it is it's a conversation to have, but if I know that doing it a different way is going to save people, then I'm going to go that direction and worry about, like, especially if I'm still using the right of way the person donated. It's just being used in a different manner. Legally, the state can do that. And then from a moral consideration, I do feel that we're still, that land is still accomplishing its original purpose, even though it's not doing it in the original method. It's a good conversation.
Yeah.
Lori.
Miss.
Julia beat me.
Go ahead, Julia.
Yeah, so I just wanted to say that with the reduction of the right turn lane, also by introducing like a narrower road overall and planting trees and then redesigning intersections to increase awareness, that all also like kind of helps to balance that out. Yeah. Also, I love this discussion. This is really, really interesting. I did a training last week with the Dutch Cycling Embassy, and there was a lot of conversation that kind of runs parallel with what we're talking about today. So
excellent. All right. So I think we've talked through most of this, but just some safe system strategies that were used in that project. See if any of these weren't used. Increasing attentiveness and awareness with the PED hybrid beacons, reducing speeds, and then reducing impact forces. So the channelized right turn lanes, is something that I think a few years ago, maybe it was more than a few years ago, District 5 at least was looking to evaluate every channelized right turn lane in the district. Do we need it for truck turning purposes? If we don't, let's find ways to get rid of them. Because we were seeing, high speed right turns conflicting with pedestrians in a lot of those cases. And so District 5's kind of been on the lookout for when we have those, do we need to have them? And then if we can remove them, let's do that. All right, so that's all we had for today.
I have a question. Thank you. You know how if there's a turn and you're like crossing over, I'm trying to think of an example, where you're crossing over multi-lanes and then you can somehow go into another shopping center or something. Is that safe? Or should you try to move the lanes so they don't match up, or the turns, I guess median openings, so they don't match up or they do match up? What's safer, or does it depend?
Yeah, I think, well, Nathan, you're the access management, former access management guy, but I'll just maybe start with the idea there is, if you think about it from the safe system principles that we were just talking about it, you have those conflicts, right? That want to be there. So it's I think what you described as a through movement across the minor, from the minor street across the major street. So the question is, how should we accommodate that movement? And you can, again, separate them in space or time. Right now, that situation is intending to separate them in time through right-of-way allocation, right? Right-of-way goes to the through vehicles on the major street, and they have to wait for a gap to go across. So contextually, you have to ask, is that gap present realistically enough times for that movement to happen? And are the speeds on that road appropriate for that type of movement to occur? So, the answer to that question is yes in some cases, and it's absolutely not in other cases. So for that particular situation, I think it's a question of, does this present a safe situation, or is it at a point where you need to restrict that type of movement? And if you do restrict it, how do you do it, right? You can directionalize that median opening, so it's not a full median opening anymore, but you're still allowing the left turns into the shopping centers. You can put in an R cut, so a signalized arc cut where you're actually allowing those movements to happen, but under signal control. So now you're adding that element of separating them in time, but with a signal rather than just allowing them to make that decision when they see gaps. Or you can make that movement happen down the road as a right turn followed by a U-turn, right? Nathan, anything you would add to how you would think about that?
So we're gonna get into that a good bit at 10, but ultimately it's, you gotta remember people are flawed, and when we start relying on judgment and the amount of information required for someone to make a good decision, a lot of those situations, there's too much going on. We see that's one of the reasons why we have protected phasing instead of permissive phasing, right? Like in that case, all you're doing is making a left turn across oncoming traffic. All you're doing is looking at the people coming straight at you and just don't turn in front of them. And we still have safety issues. So when you're dealing with, say, a full median opening and you're wanting to go across, you're dealing with however many lanes are coming this way, however many lanes are coming that way. You're dealing with anyone that's turning left out of the opposing side street. You're dealing with anyone from the main line turning into the median opening to make left turns onto the side streets. And then you're dealing with people that, like I said, if you're trying to two-stage it, now you've seen people start stacking up in the median where now you can't see past somebody because everyone else is stacking up. So it gets to where in a lot of these cases, as the roadway gets bigger, there's just not enough space to see past things. And I think that when you look at a lot of the decisions that we traditionally made, when we look at signal spacing and signal warrants and stuff like that, those criteria were made decades ago in situations that we didn't see as much today. And it makes it a lot more difficult. Like a good example, just as I know this is shifting from what you're talking about, but like the pedestrian warrant, like 20 pedestrians an hour. Like how many locations do we have 20 pedestrians an hour crossing that we're not downtown? But we still have pedestrians that are crossing and they are getting hit. So it's my point with that is when we're looking at those areas of chaos, when we're trying to solve them, whether it's kind of deviating a bit from our traditional warrants and doing intersection control regardless, or even like Ryan said, taking a right, going down and U-turning, you're shifting when you're making a decision into multiple decisions and they're spaced out down the road. You're taking away the amount of information that's required for you to make a good decision. And then you're also changing your conflict points from angle crashes to something that's more of a side swipe or rear end.
Thank you.
There is a question in the chat from Lois. Is there a sociological or other research on why the adverse consequences of driving larger and larger vehicles, such as the endangerment of others and increased environmental impacts, are tolerated?
There is, I don't know if it's a toleration. Yes and no. I think on the science side, people have, so I don't think it's exactly what you're asking for, but for the group, on the science side, there's a lot of folks that have studied it. That larger and larger came from, it's largely tracked, if you're not aware, to a rule in the Obama administration back, I want to say in 2016, that was intended to be an environmental rule. And the idea was that larger vehicles produce more carbon, so that larger vehicles would get a buy from, it may have actually been earlier than 2016. I'm trying to think. Larger vehicles would essentially get a buy from meeting certain emission standards. So it's easier to make larger vehicles than it is more efficient vehicles. And the vehicles got larger. Like it's to a point, like I have it used to be a larger truck. It looks very small now. But I have a crew cab, regular bed Silverado. It's over 6,000 pounds though. And I had an issue with law enforcement once I got pulled for a headlight that was out, but then the lady thought I stole the truck because my birthday's in September, but it's registered in December because it was technically a work truck because it was over 6,000 pounds, even though it's smaller than every other truck on the road right now. Anyway, what it's getting into though is with the marketing of the larger and larger truck, I think we've gotten into identity politics. That if you suggest anything different, it's an issue. So I think that while there probably are sociological research on it, I think that research is essentially preaches to the choir, and that it's not getting to everyone that would make a decision differently based on it. If that makes sense. Did I explain that well? Okay. Yes, hands up. I'm not sure how to pronounce your name. I'm sorry.
Hi. Yeah, it's Quisia, no worries.
Let's see it.
Yes. So my question is, so I know electric vehicles are becoming more and more popular. And if I remember correctly, electric vehicles are heavier than the average vehicle because of the weight of the battery. So I'm wondering, as we see more and more electric vehicles on the road, how would that kind of affect the safety? Because these are also heavier cars. I'm not sure if they would be bigger compared to the average car, but I know they'd be much, much heavier, I think.
I think the easiest answer is negatively. They may not be as large, but the mass issue is still there.
Yeah, I think so the organization that oversees and regulates all that is NHTSA, right, at the federal level. And so all these vehicles have to go through NHTSA safety standards, but that's really going to be focused on the vehicle and the vehicle's crashworthiness. I think the question that we're dealing with and that was brought up today is how does that impact the roadway infrastructure's crashworthiness, right? So we have crash attenuators and all that are made for certain sized vehicles, and is that now becoming not meeting really a standard that we need to meet anymore? I'm not aware of any ongoing research or thought on that topic.
Well, this is low, so I would just throw out there EVs are not emitting toxic pollutants. I mean, you're talking about trade-offs and so forth. When we have these conversations, what are the multiple dimensions of them? And plus, you have batteries and fires, and I mean, we've got no dearth of things to consider and address.
Mm-hmm.
But having vehicles that don't emit harmful things is a good thing.
Lori?
One of the reasons why I got my current vehicle is because it has great visibility, especially in the front. There's a lot of glass, more glass than some other vehicles I test drove. And so I have visibility. And then about a year ago, I rented a Bronco Sport, and I had to trust the lights on the rear. What is it? Those mirrors on the side of the car, like the rear view mirrors, but it would light up when there would be a car to my right or to my left when I was turning. And I was thinking, am I better as a human with visibility, or is it better for me to trust this vehicle? Because it was a newer model and very sensitive. But I was just thinking about it as different cameras are becoming more regular, is it better to trust certain sensors or certain lights or certain cameras? I mean, my backup camera is very helpful. But what is the research on those kinds of comparing a human versus the technology?
I don't know specifically of any research, but I will say that there is a point where the technology probably is more effective than the human.
I would add something real quick. So I drive a vehicle that has the sensors that tell me when someone's there in my blind spot, but my work vehicle doesn't have it. So I am so trained of driving my personal vehicle all the time that I legit have almost gotten over before. And I'm like, oh my gosh, because I'm relying on those lights. There's no lights. And I wasn't looking for my blind spots. And that's really dangerous when you're switching between vehicles. So I would just throw that out there.
Also, as a random comment, sometimes those sensors fail because I have mine in mine as well. And they also have a blind spot, which I unfortunately discovered by backing into a car once.
Oh no. Goodness.
Brad, you had your hand up for a little bit.
Yeah, I know. Sorry to keep harping on the right turn lane. That's the only one that's really caught my attention because I think it's like where there's decisions being made right now for sure, where like a new Wawa is coming in and like we're making them put a right turn lane in due to volume. You know, there's probably permits across the state that are doing this. So that's the one that just I'm like, if that is like a policy decision, I feel like some manuals and like mindsets need to change that. I get, you know, or greater consideration for, okay, what's the bike volume on this road, or, you know, and what some kind of extra measure of when we're not going to have a development put in a right turn lane.
I think so. One thing I think I would say with that is it doesn't mean that right turn lanes are bad everywhere, right? So there's a lot that went into that corridor with a concerted effort to slow speed. It's kind of like street trees. Like street trees are great for that sense of encroachment and speed calming. But if I take street trees and put them on a 35-mile-an-hour facility to try to get it to 25, it's a safety feature. If I put a street tree on a 45 to 55-mile-an-hour facility, it's a safety hazard. Like there's a certain, and it's kind of like with right turn lanes. Like if I'm on a, you know, we live in more rural areas. So if I'm on US 17 out between cities and there's nothing out there except some development pops out, they're 100% going to get a right turn lane. Like we're not touching it. And in that Wawa situation, if you do not have, there are decisions being made, but if you're not set up corridor wide to start doing some of that and set expectation, it may be an issue. What I would suggest moving forward with permits though, so you've noticed, I'm sure, that the 1496 has changed with their study requirements, right?
Vaguely familiar. I'm in design, so like sometimes
Okay.
interact with permit access management, but not like frequently.
All right, so what happened? Florida Administrative Code 1496 and 1497 deal with access management. So 1496 is the permitting, like here's what level traffic study you need here. Like if you're in design and you're doing driveway modifications, you need to send certain letters out, the nice letter, nasty letter. If they disagree, the administrative court, stuff like that. 1497 is your spacing standards. So in 1496, it talked about traffic. And normally that was your ITE Green Book looking at the trip generation manual, or not Green Book, the trip generation manual, sorry. In what year was it? Late, is a few years before 2020. District 7 had an issue. There was a restaurant on one side of the road, and they put their parking lot on the other side. And District 7 tried to make them put in RFB because there's an obvious attractor and generator, right? Like they're going to park in the parking lot, they're going to walk across the road to get to the restaurant. The permittees didn't want to spend the money to do it. They went to administrative court. The court ruled in the favor of the permittee. The judge told FDOT that if they had some level, it didn't have to be precise, but some level of methodology or scientific-ish assessment of how to measure pedestrian trip generation, that they would be required to do it. And that set off a multimodal task team, and it went for years. When COVID happened, the task team kind of broke up and they went to do traveling. Jenna Bowman was working on it. So they went and did a rewrite. I think, so I've been gone, I think 3 years now. When I was still here, Richard Shine started on the rewrite. So Richard Shine is the lawyer in central office. We were working on 1496. Jenna Bowman, I think, took it to the finish line with Richard. They put in requirements now for both for ICE a requirement to do ice, as well as multimodal trip generation. So the point I'm having behind that is, since in 1496 in your traffic studies, they're now required to look at multimodal considerations and trip generation. I would, if it were me in the position, I would push for the sidewalk donation. Because the sidewalk donation is going to be pushed up against the back of right of way. You depend in an urban section, you still may have that right turn lane, but in the end, even if you take the right turn lane, you still have that sidewalk. So it doesn't mean necessarily that in that current one, if your roadway isn't set up for right turn lane, that you abort from that currently. But it does mean that you're getting the facilities in there so that they have the land to accommodate all modes of traffic, right? Like, we've had donations all over the place, like 31. 31 is going through Badcock Ranch, and they are donating land to completely realign the roadway right now. That doesn't mean that we can't come back later and change the typical section. So if we came in like tomorrow, that might be an issue, just because but I think as people's needs change, like, we can't be locked into a decision that was made a decade ago. Julia, what was one thing you learned at your training? Not this one, but the Dutch one, the Dutch cycling one.
Yeah. The thing that was most interesting to me, I think, I can share a link in the chat, but they showed us this really awesome video on Dutch methodology for redesigning intersections to make them safer for pedestrians and cyclists in particular, because, the training was centered on cycling. And one thing they talked about is, I believe it's called a keyhole. We do those pretty often here, where, like, in order to get into the right-hand turn lane, you have to cross over a bike lane. Usually there's some kind of striping or green, like, indicator to show the conflict, but that's really dangerous, because then essentially you have to look over your right shoulder to see if there's a cyclist. So the video explained how the Dutch have redesigned intersections to essentially bring the cars back and bring the cyclists forward in a way that, first of all, you don't have to cross over the bike lane in this kind of sideways motion, but you have to interact with them head on, which means that you have to make eye contact essentially with the cyclist. And in general, though, there's a lot of other methods involved, whether it's like bringing the median out to force people to make wider left turns, and then making refuge for pedestrians within that island. They use tinted asphalt for all of their bike lanes, red asphalt. So, and there's a lot of like narrowing at the intersection, like bulge outs and things like that. So yeah, there's like many layers to the design and the design methodology, whether it's like increasing safety, but also increasing comfort and things like that. So it was really fascinating. Yeah, I'll find that video. I'll share it right now in the chat. So it blew my mind.
Yeah, no, that's really cool. And it's encouraging that we're starting to get some of that. I mean, FHWA came up with their guide, which basically is built on user comfort. Yeah, one of the things you talked about, like is hardened center lines, that we can do right now is push people out in the intersection. We just have to make the decision to do it. We've using medians as pedestrian refuges. I also posted a link to NCHRP 948. It's a guide for pedestrians, bicycle safety at intersections. And what it does is it introduces something called the 20 flags method. So it may not be as perfect as what you were learning about, but it does give kind of like a 20 flags checklist as you go through an intersection, and help like rank decisions. If you're deciding, hey, should we do this? Should we do that? You can compare the two in like a point system for helping with bicycle and pedestrian safety. So that's something to might check out as well.
I think the other thing that was really profound was that like they didn't start in the Netherlands building cycling infrastructure until the late 70s, early 80s. Like it's a fairly new phenomenon over the past like 40 years that they've developed this like cycling paradise. And that there was a ton of pushback at first. There was a lot of trial and error. Like they've come to these design methodologies through error, essentially, which I think is really interesting. And it's very like beneficial for us because like, well, these people have figured it out already. So like we can use that as a springboard for our own context. But yeah, and the fact there was so much pushback, like to the point where especially along corridors where there were business owners, wherever they were like changing the right of way to give more to cyclists, like they would hire people to go out in the middle of the night to tear up all of the cycling infrastructure that was being built. Like it was crazy.
That's crazy.
I just want to ditto something Julia said about I take transit and walk regularly. And they had the ability of drivers to see people who are walking, people who are biking, the face-to-face thing. I do a lot of waving to make sure, hoping to get the wave back so someone's not going to plow over me when I'm in a crosswalk. But that, I mean, the more that happens, I think that's critical to building more sensitivity in drivers to other users of the road. And also for pedestrians to take that responsibility for their own safety, which shouldn't be the case, but it is.
I mean, I'm not encouraging this. This is not an official opinion, but have you seen the commercials where they have like fake bricks to give the pedestrians? They get a lot more respect on the roadway.
That can go really bad.
What's that?
That can go really bad, right?
But Lois, I like the conversation about new measures. That we've done a lot of research work as well recently about especially like peak hour, like when we start talking about peak hour and how everything's designed for that. We've done a lot of research on different measures. There's some work we did even with signal timing, like instead of looking at just level of service and delay for vehicles, but adding transit delay, pedestrian level of comfort, pedestrian delay, adding those in. And when you start doing it, your decision-making process starts changing a lot when you start actually looking at effective measures of effectiveness for everyone and not just a single type of user at an intersection.
Yeah, this is an important part of it. We've been doing research in the use of a multimodal system productivity measure. It's been developed for federal highway. It looks at the whole transportation system, looks for complete trips by whatever mode. Trips are on par with one another. A walking trip is as valuable as a driving trip. It gets a person from their origin to their destination, or maybe a series of trips. So how productive is the multimodal transportation system? So you can see the modes interacting as well as seeing the overall productivity of a system. And it's in-person trips. It's not throughput. So that's a moving thing. And things like multimodal accessibility. How long does it take you to walk to this versus driving or transit and all of those sorts of things? So I think this is a really important complement to getting to our aspiration of true multi-mobility and safe multi-mobility.
No, that's really good to hear. Actually, that's very nice.
I can send you an early research paper if you're interested in what Federal Highway's up to. And this was in response to when Federal Highway and FTA had to do federal performance measures under Federal Surface Transportation Acts. And some had to do with system performance, and they didn't have anyone that would capture multimodal mobility. It was travel time reliability on the interstates, the non-NHS. So they started this research on some sort of multimodal measure or series or set of measures to use in addition to what they'd already put out there for system performance. So it's interesting times.
Yeah. I mean, even we just did a primer for FHWA as well on speed setting. And while we weren't able to get as aggressive as we would like. It's to support the METCD, they are backing off the 85th percentile a little bit, and looking at a 6-factor method. And then we're also able to introduce the idea of a target speed nationwide, which is, it seems small because like Florida's been doing it, but it's actually, I mean, I don't know, it's pretty cool. There's a lot of people that aren't. Florida is definitely leading the way in a lot of different things.